Hi, welcome to A Film Darkly, where I discuss the philosophical concepts found within movies. I'm your host, Anthony Paceno, and in this episode I'm going to be discussing Groundhog Day, which is sort of a far cry from the other three episodes I've done, which were all deeply philosophical films. Groundhog Day, however, is a comedy starring Bill Murray, and it doesn't really come off as a philosophical film, and in a way it isn't. But at the same time, it is, because the concept of Groundhog Day and following the phases that the main character Phil goes through, you sort of get an answer, or you do get an answer, to the ethical dilemma found within human nature. So if you can remember, if you can recall, and you've listened to my other episodes, in the first episode I talked about The Watchmen, and I discussed the comedian and how the comedian is this character that recognizes human beings sort of have a downward spiral about them. They have a declining nature that is very animalistic and is what ultimately makes them inconsistent. So, however hard human beings might try to live by rules and to try and be good people, they ultimately are not good people. They're always at their at each other's throats. They're always going to war. And so the comedian believes that the only way justice will ever be enacted is when human beings destroy themselves. When this whole Cold War, which is the setting of The Watchmen, when it finally comes to when it finally comes to a head and we see ourselves blow each other up, to which, no one will be left, and that's when the comedian feels justice will be enacted, because human beings deserve death in his eyes, because they're so inconsistent. They're animal, and at the same time they're trying not to be animal. So then you have The Dark Knight, where the Joker sort of embodies this nihilistic idea, this idea that we are just animal, so why are we trying to be so inconsistent by attempting to live by rules? That doesn't make sense. So that's why the Joker says the only sensible way to live is without any rules at all. Because in his eyes, all we are is this flesh. There's nothing more to us. We're not created by a god. We're not special in some way. We're just derived from accident. That's why I mentioned that he doesn't believe in metaphysical ontology, which would be metaphysical being the study of being, and ontology being foundation. So he doesn't believe that there's anything to our foundation that is meaningful, but rather it's meaningless. Thus, believing we are nothing more than material creatures, just these animals. So the Joker believes that rather than be inconsistent and try and act like we're not, let's be consistent and try and act like we are. Or act as though we are. So from there, I moved on to Ghost in the Shell. And the reason I moved on to Ghost in the Shell is because Ghost in the Shell is a good look at human nature from another perspective. That is not thinking about how human beings are constantly on the decline because of their desires and because of their animalistic tendencies, but that human beings are more than that, that they're conscious, and that this consciousness is something that can derive from anything else besides the flesh. So in other words, it doesn't matter what the machine is. The machine can always bring about consciousness. Whether it's the physical machine or whether it's the robotic machine, it doesn't matter. Sentience or consciousness transcends the body. And so if human beings have this side of themselves that transcends the body, the question that comes to mind is, which is the real you? The body or the consciousness? To which Ghost in the Shell answers that question by saying, your consciousness is you. This is why we observe that verse in Corinthians where Paul says that he looked in the mirror and sees the dim image. The dim image is your physical you. That's not you, though. So you're beyond that. You're beyond that image. And Ghost in the Shell, obviously I explored this a lot more in that podcast. So if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it, because it really establishes that human beings are more than just the flesh. So if we're more than just the flesh, is it reasonable to come to the same conclusion as the Joker and say we need to live by this fleshly ideology, by this ideology that there's nothing to us? Well, according to the foundation or the metaphysical ontology that's presented in Ghost in the Shell, the answer would be no, because we're supposed to be pertaining to this non-physical self as opposed to this physical self. And that's where Groundhog Day really touches on human beings. It touches on human beings not necessarily from this conscious level, but from this perspective that human beings can achieve happiness not by living as the creature that they are, not as living according to the machine, quote unquote, but according to the consciousness, according to the ghost in the machine. And living by that nature means that we can transcend the animalistic nature and be happy by living a better set of standards. But what is that set of standards? How do you achieve that happiness? What is that happiness? This is where Groundhog Day comes in. So I'm going to go ahead and now start on Groundhog Day. So at the start of Groundhog Day, we're introduced to Phil, who's played by Bill Murray. And Phil is just a jerk. That's the best way to describe him. He hates people. He hates his job. He hates his life. He hates everything, really. And he's just an unhappy guy. So now he has this new producer named Rita, played by Andie MacDowell, in his life. And he most obviously has sort of a crush on Rita. And Rita is the MacGuffin of the film, which is that's the object of his desire, the thing he's chasing. When he reaches and gets a hold of the MacGuffin, he will have been fulfilled, so to speak. That's the film's idea. Now Rita is pretty much opposite Phil. She's a kind, loving woman, and people like her, and people love being around her. She's also a producer, and the story goes that Phil is going to this town called Punxsutawney, which I'm going to have a difficult time saying that all the time. I'm probably always going to pause saying that word because for whatever reason I struggle with it. And he goes to Punxsutawney because they have this tradition of a real groundhog that they pull out of this log, and they do this whole ceremony, and it's going according to the groundhog legend, which the groundhog pops out of the ground, looks around. If he sees his shadow, more winter. If he doesn't, no more winter. Or winter ends like usual. So they do this whole ceremony, and Phil hates it. Phil thinks it's like just horrible. He hates the town. He doesn't like living. He doesn't like staying in the common hotel they usually give him. So Rita actually sets him up with this like great bed and breakfast, which is a little better, but he still hates the town people. So Phil ends up getting stuck in Punxsutawney because because of this blizzard that comes through, which he actually predicted would not come through, but he was wrong, as weathermen usually are. And I don't even think I said he was a weatherman, but he is a weatherman. So anyways, Phil gets stuck living in Punxsutawney one more night. So he goes to sleep. Next day he wakes up and everything's the same. The radio station playing the same song, talking about it being Groundhog Day. He walks out of his hotel room, runs into the same guy. Goes downstairs, runs into Mrs. Lancaster again. She says the same stuff. He goes over to see Rita and has to do his little thing all over again of reporting on the Groundhog, who is also named Phil, which I don't know if I said that already, but who's also named Phil. And so he has to do this whole report and stuff. So he's kind of tripping out a little. And at the end of the day, he kind of tests what he thinks happened. And he takes a pencil and he breaks it. And he sets it on his bedstand. Wakes up in the morning and he finds the pencils together. This is phase 1, which is his freak out. He completely freaks out. And he doesn't even get what's going on. So he freaks out to the point that he comes out of his hotel. He kind of rushes, doesn't talk to anyone. There's this guy he meets from his old high school named Ned Ryerson. He punches Ned Ryerson in the face. And he basically tells Rita, I'm not even doing the interview. Just meet me at the Tip Top Cafe. So they meet at the cafe. Rita's like, you need to go get an x-ray. You need to go get your brain checked out and all this stuff. So he actually does. And this is where we get the cameo from Harold Ramis. And he gets an x-ray. There's nothing wrong. He goes and sees a psychiatrist. And they can't figure out how to deal with him. So from here, realization starts to settle in of his situation. Now remember, Phil's a jerk. So essentially, Phil being handed the same day over and over again is kind of interesting because it's sort of like handing a little boy a gun, so to speak. It's like handing someone the ability to do something when they themselves are not the kind of person that is disciplined enough to handle that thing. Okay, so there's Phil's sitting at in a bowling alley with a character named Gus and this other guy who they never say his name. At least I don't believe they do. I tried looking it up. I can't find this guy's name. And Phil's sitting there and he says something really interesting. He says, what would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing that you did mattered? And he's asking Gus and this other guy. And the other guy says, that about sums it up for me. Sums it up for him? What does he mean by that? Is he also living the Groundhog Day? No, he's not. But see, what Phil was saying there wasn't something that anyone wouldn't be able to relate to. How many of us have a job that we really don't like? We really don't care for. And we have a routine we do every single day. Every single day we go through this same exact routine. We get bored out of our skulls because of this same old routine. And so what do? We go on what we call quote unquote vacations. And what are vacations? Vacations are just getting out of the norm. A vacation is as simple as if you live here in California and where I live, 2 hours away, Pismo Beach. That's a vacation. Because all you did was, and all you really did was drive so many miles to a beach. That's it. You just drove to a beach. But you think it's so special. Why? Because it's out of the ordinary. It's not part of your routine. That's what makes weekends so fun. Because a weekend, you get to do what? Go do whatever. Wherever you want. Whenever you want. You sleep in. Sleeping in feels fun. It's lazy, but why is it fun? It's fun because it's out of the norm. So Phil is sort of representing actual human beings, our actual lives, which is people who live the same day every single day and just want something different. And sometimes that something different could be something bad, not something good. This is why we get people who do things like skydiving, who do these crazy stunts where you're like, why would you do that? Because it's out of the norm. And you feel alive when you do things like that because all of a sudden your life's at risk. You're not just going through motions. You're doing something that not a lot of people in this world would even consider doing. So let's go ahead and move on now. So after this, Gus realizes he's too drunk to drive, so does the other guy, and Phil drives them. And when Phil's driving them, he asks them a question. He says, let me ask you guys a question. What if there was no tomorrow? And Gus answers and says, "No tomorrow? That would mean there would be no consequences. There'd be no hangovers. We could do whatever we wanted." And Phil says, "That's true. We could do whatever we want." And he starts driving like a maniac. Drives on the railroad tracks. Does all these crazy things. And while he's doing this, he keeps saying stuff like, "You're not, I have to clean my room. I'm not supposed to go here. I'm not supposed to go there." Talking about rules that he's had since he was a little boy. And at one point he finally says, "I'm not going to live by their rules anymore. You make choices and you live with them." Now, Phil's whole live with them is in two different ways. Because mentally you live with something, but sometimes you also live with consequences of something. For Phil, though, there are no consequences now. He's stuck in this day. So imagine that. You give a person who lives a routine every single day, bored out of their skull, and one day they wake up and they're living the exact same day, live it again, live it again, live it again, and they finally say to themselves, "You know what? There's no consequences to this day." It's like handing the kid a gun. And I say a kid because a kid's not going to be responsible. Responsibility, though, doesn't matter. This is when Phil reaches phase 2, which is the phase of no consequences. Phil gets arrested, wakes up the next day, he's at home, or in the hotel. So he's cheerful, he's gleeful, because guess what? Phil gets to do whatever Phil wants. Phil gets to be an Uber jerk now. He doesn't have to just be a normal jerk. Phil gets to be anything. He even gets to be like the Joker. Now, we never see that out of Phil because you're talking about I can't remember if it's PG or PG-13 film, but we understand that Phil has the potential to be that kind of person. And so Phil does things like, he starts doing whatever he wants. He kisses Mrs. Lancaster. This is actually when he punches Ned. Earlier I said he punches Ned. I meant to say he pushes Ned. So this is where he punches Ned. Then there's a part where he's in the Tip Top Cafe and he's eating anything and everything. And Annie McDowell comes in, Rita, and she starts talking to him. And she's just like, "You're sick." And Phil stuffs this whole cake in his mouth. And he looks over at Rita and he says, "What?" With his mouth all stuffed. And that's when she reads, she cites a piece of poetry by Sir Walter Scott that says, the wretch concentred all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung." And what Rita is doing is predicting the next phase. Phil doesn't see it right now. Maybe this is a phase for the Joker as well. I don't know if I can absolutely say that. But it would seem that Joker becomes content with that nihilistic type of living and living with no consequences, whereas Phil doesn't become content with this, and there's a reason why. So we continue with Phil, and he's kind of manipulating women and sleeping with them. He robs a truck. And since he has this day with no consequences where he could potentially learn about anybody and then the next day, try and use the information he learned to sleep with them, in this manipulating fashion, he attempts it with Rita. And we get this whole sequence where, he tries to he orders a drink. Rita orders a drink. His drink's way different from hers. The next day he goes, orders the same drink. Next day, he screws up to something else. Next day he comes in, says what she wants. Next day. And then we just keep getting that over and over until he fails. He absolutely fails. Because he's been tricking her into thinking he's something he's not. And so again and again and again, he is failing with Rita. So he's failing with his desire, with the MacGuffin. He can't get the MacGuffin. So potentially Phil can get whatever he wants because of this no consequence day, but he can't get the one thing he wants the most. That's when Phil enters phase 3, which is the meaninglessness. the phase of meaninglessness. He gets up the next day, he's projecting his anger, and he's just saying things that are not making sense, and he's sad. He's beyond sad because he's realizing it's not making me happy to live out my fleshly desires as though there are no consequences. It's not making me happy at all. He's trying his best to live according to his needs, his desires. And it's not working because he can't get the one thing he desires the most. So he walks up to Rita at one point and he says, I've come to the end of me, Rita. There's no way out now. I just want you to remember we had a beautiful day together once. And that's when Phil kidnaps the Groundhog, and there's this whole funny moment where he's driving with the Groundhog, and he drives himself off a cliff, and he dies. Only to wake up the next day alive again. Why? Because apparently the Groundhog Day grants him immortality as well. And so Phil starts trying to kill himself over and over and over and over. Or not trying, he is. He's killing himself over and over and over again. And then he just keeps waking up. And there comes this moment where he's talking to Rita. And it's sort of the moment of self-reflection. He's talking to her and he tells her, that he's God. He's like a God. And she's like, you're God? And he goes, I'm not the God. He goes, I think. And then, she's like, mentioning God, and he's like, well, what if God's just a person who isn't really all powerful? He's just been around a really long time, so he knows everything. Phil's just kind of being facetious, just sort of like, he doesn't understand his situation, and he doesn't know what to think about it. But near the end, while they're at the cafe, at the Tip Top Cafe again, Phil tells Rita, he says, the worst part is that the next day, you're going to forget. That's the worst part of it. And she's like, no, I won't. And he goes, yes, you will. He goes, you'll forget and you'll treat me like a jerk again. And she's like, oh, no, I'm not. And he says, it's all right. I am a jerk. Phil finally sees who Phil is. He comes to face with himself. That Phil just isn't a good person. Now, there's some stuff that Rita says where she says that maybe it's a blessing. And almost kind of insinuates that he needs to seize the opportunity to be able to do good with this day that he's living over and over. And there's an interesting thing that he says that to Rita just before she falls asleep, and he's going to wake up the next day and be back, in his same routine. And he tells her, he's reading from a book, and she says, what was the last thing you said? And he said, I think the last thing you heard was, only God can make a tree. And so we're going to use that in a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and move on to phase 4, which is seizing the opportunity. The first thing he does is he starts to improve himself. He helps out the homeless man on the corner who he never helped out before. He starts treating people really good, bringing them coffee and pastries. He starts learning by reading philosophical books. If you actually look at the stack of books he has on the counter in the cafe, some of them are philosophy books. He starts taking piano lessons. He learns to ice sculpt. And so he's doing all these various things to self-improve and make himself a better person than he's ever been before. Because he's finally looked inward and seen the jerk that he is. And he's saying, maybe I should treat this day as a blessing. And just learn everything I need to learn. Not use it as a no consequence day. As sort of this, forget using it as this gun wildly. Why not use it in the most disciplined way I possibly can? And that's what he starts to do. And while doing this self-reflection, Phil comes to this moment where he sees the homeless man, and the homeless man's coughing, and he says, let's get you a place to stay tonight. And I think he calls him Father. And he takes him to the hospital, and a nurse comes out and tells Phil that the old man died. And Phil's like, how? And she's like, he was just old. So he's like, no. She goes, people die sometimes. And he goes, not today. And he runs to the back and he picks up his chart, the old man's chart, and he looks it over. And she's like, sometimes people just die. And, he's really, really frustrated with that. So the next day, he gets the old man early on, and he basically seems like he gives him the best day possible. Feeding him and just giving him a warm place to stay the whole time. And he's just totally helping out this homeless guy. And at the end of the day, the homeless man is laying in an alley, and Phil is sitting there trying to resuscitate him, trying to get him to keep breathing. And the man doesn't breathe anymore, and he dies. And Phil realizes something about himself. He realizes that even though he has this one day to live every day over and over and over again, and potentially he can do a lot of things because of that, Phil isn't God. Only God can make a tree. Phil realizes at that moment that he's still finite Phil. Sure, he's self-reflecting and improving himself. Sure, he knows everything there is to know about that day. But when he tells that nurse, not today, as if he could stop death, Phil is hit with something. And he's sitting there trying to save this man, and he can't. And in his frustration, he looks up to the sky to a bright light. And that's all right there depicted in the film. I don't know how purposeful it is, but it is. What has happened to Phil is when Phil began to help the homeless man, he was facing the other. He was doing all that he could to help out the other. And by trying to help the other, by trying to fulfill the golden rule of love your neighbor as yourself, Phil came face to face with the infinite, as Levinas would put it, Immanuel Levinas, a Jewish philosopher. He came face to face with happiness, as Aristotle would put it. Not happiness in that this old man is dead. No, he's face to face with reality that he can't prevent death. But what he can do is try to live for the other as much as he can. To understand that people die, that people live their lives doing their own routines, and one day they leave this earth. And that the best thing you could possibly do for them is to not treat them like garbage and be another negative impact on their daily routine, but to try to love them like you love you. To try and be good to them. To break your routine of thinking it's all about you. It's not about you. You're powerless to a lot of things, but there are a lot of things you can help, and that is others. If you can help others. This is what makes things like church so good for people, because it's community. It's what makes things like having a club. For instance, here there's a Silver and Black Raiders club. There's even a club for the now Los Angeles Rams. What makes clubs so good? Why is that such a great thing? Because it allows you to face the other. It creates community. Diversity. That's what's so beautiful. That's what we need, is that. And that is what Phil is doing. He's finally facing the other. So the next day, Phil lives the best day possible. He helps every person he can around the town. He gives to people. He goes and participates in events and all this sort of stuff. He's just a community guy, and everybody knows and loves Phil. That is when Rita notices him. Because somehow Phil didn't remain that vile, vile man in the dust. Phil managed to climb out of that because Phil stopped looking at Phil. He self-reflected on Phil, seeing what kind of animal Phil can be, and said, I need to look elsewhere, and he did. He self-improved himself, so he first modified himself to begin to gain information and to begin to study and become a better person. But he did the most important thing of all. He faced the other. He started to look at other people. And Rita notices this, and he finally gets Rita. He finally gets the object of his desires. He finally gets the MacGuffin. He doesn't get the MacGuffin, though, until he realizes that it's not about him. That's the interesting thing. Phil gets everything he could possibly desire. The happiness that he's been searching for. And he gets it by not caring about him so much, but caring more about everyone else. This is what Groundhog Day is so great at putting forth. It's showing us that sure, we can act like we're animal and live as though we're animal and live inconsistently in that or in this manner, but ultimately happiness is never going to be fulfilled through that. Our issue is that we're constantly trying to live by the flesh. We're constantly trying to live by the machine. Make the machine happy. The machine's happy with food. The machine is happy with certain drinks. The machine is happy with certain things you do that are pleasurable to the machine. But guess what? None of those pleasures last. They're only fun for a season and then they go away. That's why we get caught in that routine of Groundhog Day, where we live our day every single day exactly the same exact routine, and we get bored out of our skulls. And for some people, their life is so dreary, they do the most completely, incredibly inhumane things you could possibly do. For some people, they just go out and do crazy stuff. But we all do these things because we're trying to break that Groundhog Day. We're trying to break that common routine. And now you could go the Joker route and say, you know what? Forget the rules. I'm going to live like this. But you're still not going to be happy. Because you're just trying to, in the most extreme way, you're trying to hyper live the routine. Trying to fulfill your fleshly desires. And that's just not ever going to bring you happiness. If you want the happiness Aristotle talked about, the infinite that Levinas talked about, if you want those kinds of things, if you want that fulfillment, that unsatisfactory satisfaction, where you're consistently striving for something, but you're doing it with a smile, the best thing you could possibly do is break the self-absorbed routine and start to look at the other person. Start to look at other people, become cultural, become diverse, you'll go to church. If church isn't your thing, get yourself involved in communities. Get yourself involved with people. And the more you get involved with people, the more you start to see the other, the more happy you're going to become. Because you finally have community. A place where you could share your woes. A place where you could share, you could share your thoughts. And you could think. And you could share information. And be loving toward one another. Which is the greatest thing of all. Loving oneself is not as fulfilling as loving other people. So, I think I'm going to end with that last note. stay tuned. I am going to be doing another episode. I'm not sure what it's going to be on right now, but just to let you guys know, in the future, I do plan on doing Walking Dead and Hierarchy. I do plan on taking a look at Darth Vader and Star Wars. I do plan on doing the film Signs. If you haven't seen Signs, Signs is a neat little film, but it has a very strong philosophical idea at the end. So just stay tuned for what's to come, and if you are subscribed, if you are someone who listens to the show, feel free to leave a comment and ask about a movie that you'd like me to break down philosophically. I'd be more than willing to do so. So anyhow, hope you guys enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for listening. See ya.